All right, let's jump right in. One one way of looking at the practice of meditation, or the practice at large, of which meditation, wisdom, ethics all form a part. One way of looking at the practice is that it is uh, preparation for our death, to die rightly, to die well. I want to talk a little bit about what that means, um, just as an introduction, just as a way to start thinking about how to incorporate this into your practice. Because I mean, obviously, it can be an upsetting topic, or it certainly be easily misunderstood. Uh, the idea that practice and the work that we're talking about here is anticipating death doesn't mean looking forward to it in a macabre or morbid way. It's recognizing that without doubt, right, without question, we're all going to die. We don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know why, but we can prepare for it. And what I'm suggesting here is that preparing for it, preparing for the future mortality, actually um, in itself is necessary, but changes our engagement with the moment here in a really positive way. And I might get there a little bit differently from what you've heard before, because well, to start with, I'll lay out a straw person, right? The, this is true, but it's not, I think, a compelling truth. One way of looking at it is um, we know we're going to die. It could be tomorrow, it could be before I'm done with this video, and so let us appreciate the moment as it is now, because it could be our last. Right? And that catechism, that logic is irrefutable. But I think it's missing a couple of points, and I think what I want to think about is um, experientially. What do we really think? So yesterday in the video, I was talking about um, a moment when I was walking through the dark uh, early morning in the city, listening to some Messiaen, seeing the stars, and for just a moment, having this sense of the stars being connected like synapses, like in our brain, uh, with this really bright neon green color. And that this has become almost iconic for me of what maybe what it is uh, to be mortal. And I use that language because mortality implies death, which implies immortality, which implies resurrection. Like all of these words belong together with this mysterious construct. And I'm certainly not going to say anything here that you should listen and think, oh, there's an answer, there's a truth. But what I would like to suggest is that there's a way of thinking about our death that embodies a truth, and that there are certain parts of our practice that allow us to actually anticipate, meaning to prefigure, to experience beforehand what that might look like. So one of the things about mortality is that it extends beyond uh, what we really recognize as our self, right? We think our self is the body, the thoughts that I have right now, the microphone in front of me, the experiences I'm having right now is who I am. But when we consider the vectors of scale, and I use those words specifically and quite often in this context. The vectors of scale are uh, size, distance, duration. And when we are confronted with objects that are vastly outside the scope of our immediate senses, which includes the sense of a kind of a human lifespan, then in order to understand those experiences, we're compelled to recognize that we are mortal, that there's a veil of physiology, a veil of metabolism, and the very fact that we can contemplate the age of the universe, or that we can listen to a piece of music that implies a pattern that extends for a millennia. All right, I talked about Messiaen yesterday, and one of the techniques that I find particularly beautiful and wonderful in Messiaen is the rhythmic canons, rhythmic patterns that are played against each other, and the true realignment, right, when the pattern, that the original patterns start back at the beginning, could be 100 years from now, could be 1,000 years from now, depending on the complexity of the pattern. And what Messiaen does is take a snippet, a window of that pattern, and it exposes us to the vector of scale, of duration, longer than my body will remain, right? Longer than my metabolism will support. So the music, the aesthetic object, compels a confrontation with that vector. I think this explains why some of the human artifacts that we look at have an aesthetic resonance. Right? If we're forced to consider something that's very, very fast, so fast that we could not perceive it without a tool, that also suggests that the mechanics of our metabolism are constrained, and yet they are constrained on top of a broader set of experiences. Distance. I think that the vector of distance is where we start to see things like the overview effect, right? So the overview effect is something that's quite consistently described by astronauts as they circle the Earth. And it's more than just the obvious looking at the Earth as a single, and then recognizing that national borders mean very little when you're looking at the Earth from orbit. It really does sound like a spiritual realization that the point of the Earth, not the point as in the purpose, but the point that in which the Earth resides is one part of a panoply of experience, and obviously then the human experience within that. I have not experienced the overview effect, but I think you get a taste of it when you are flying in an airplane, and I think more clearly you get a taste of the overview effect when you're asked to imagine patterns that extend. The only way to visualize or to experience those patterns would be to hover above the Earth. So, for example, ley lines, right, the old straight tracks that that may just be old trade routes, but may also be representations of the power of the Earth that our Neolithic ancestors carved and marked with henges and ultimately cathedrals. To experience the ley lines, you have to float, right? And we can do that in our imagination. We all can do that. What I would suggest is that our ability to do that, even though it seems so readily available, is actually the first step towards anticipating the mortal state. death is a veil. Right? I forget who said that. Probably everybody says that. But what I think is a compelling realization is that anything we might imagine that happens after we die, whether that is sort of karmic rebirth, whether that's like a Christ-like physical resurrection, whether it's the sort of blank nothingness that someone like Philip Larkin fears. I mean, this is what Socrates is saying in the Apology, right? He's prepared for his death. Now he knows it's coming. He knows he can see the clock ticking down. And he says, if it's really nothing, if it's really the end, well, we won't know. Right? I think when we fear death, we fear the awareness of nothingness. We fear that it's like a prison. We're stuck without the ability to move, like we're trapped in a blank, never-ending box. But the very fact of awareness of that suggests to me that that's just a false premise. So if it truly is lights out, well, there you go. But if it's not, and as Socrates says, if he now gets to sit and talk with the wisest of the wise for eternity, well, that's pretty great. My thought, my sense, and again, this is just an intuition, is that to a great extent, we shape that experience. I think at a certain point that will no longer be true, but I'm fairly certain that the immediate experience will react to our expectations. Excuse me. Take that for what it's worth. But what I think is important is that no matter what that is, some psychedelic transcendental experience of the hyperspace, right? The glittering hypercube, or having dinner with Socrates, or being greeted by Reggie, my good old dog. I would suggest that the idea of a sequel, an event and a sequel, is not helpful and perhaps misguided. And that instead, that moment, the actual moment of mortality, is a moment of clarity and a moment of freedom from delusion. A shift. Like the 2012 Mayan calendar shift, where in some regards nothing changed, but in other regards everything changed. My supposition, my intuition is that when our body dies, maybe not a whole lot else changes. Now, a lot has changed because you no longer have a body. And I think the sense of individual self probably evaporates. So that's quite a lot to change. But it doesn't make sense to me that things end. And I think the practice, meditation, ethics, responsibly stewarding the resources we have now so that when that happens, the first thought isn't one of regret, right? I think that's really important. The ability to approach that moment when the vectors of scale collapse with no possible alternative. To approach that moment with clarity, with comfort, and then to kind of bring that same approach to every moment and see this not as a sequel, but as returning to the flatland image. The square becomes a cube, the cube becomes a hypercube. Each of those moments feels like death. All right, good. So I wanted to make this video as part of this week's series. I know it's a difficult topic, and I know that it's a confusing one, and I hope that what I've said has prompted some thoughts, and I would love to hear from you if you have questions or if you would like to dialogue back and forth a little bit. All in on that. But this is important, and it's at the core of the practice. Everything else comes from this practice. So, all right, keep your wits about you.